I'm doing a little follow-up on what happened on the Tamir Rice case. Obviously, you can see this is CNN, and there are two commentators that are going to speak about the decision and the process and the ramifications.
Let me just bring you back in because there's a lot to go through. Number one, the fact that we now know that criminal charges will not be brought. What did they have to go through, this process with this grand jury, to arrive at that decision?
What happens is the grand jury is impaneled, and then it's up to the district attorney to present whatever information they think is relevant or appropriate for that grand jury to determine. Again, the district attorney controls the grand jury, the flow of information, what they hear, what they may not hear, and of course what charges ultimately they could or should not consider.
Right.
And that of course calls into question, and the community I think is going to be very concerned about the independence of the process. I think you're hearing not only in this community but throughout the country that there potentially needs to be some separate and apart. Exactly.
Yes.
When you have a local prosecutor who works with officers, who relies upon officers for investigations, for arrests, to make the community safe, it's very difficult for that particular district attorney now to prosecute those officers. So if there is some independent process, I think it just breeds more trust into the process itself. Now the grand jury's convened, the grand jury has concluded that there won't be any charges, and now we turn to the civil process, which really determines whether there was negligence. But before getting to that, I think there are going to be two very overriding questions here in addition to the process. Number one, remember that the argument always has been that the officer, that is Lohman and Garmbach, who was driving, they created the condition. So to what extent, if you create the dangerous condition by rolling up upon a scene and a situation, are you now entitled to, as you know, as was said by the attorneys representing the Tamir Rice family, shoot your way out of it? That's
exactly
one situation. The second big issue is, should Lohman have been on the force to begin with? We know he was discharged for incompetence from the law enforcement place in Independence, Ohio, before he got to this particular area.
There is so much more I want to get to, including
Yes.
the fact that you know that the officers did not testify in front of the grand jury. There were statements that were given, so I want to make sure we hear the officer side of things, and also more from what we've heard Tamir's family, Tamir Rice's family, how the community could potentially respond to the fact, again, as we've heard from the Cuyahoga County prosecutor, that those two officers involved in the shooting death of 12-year-old Tamir Rice 2 Novembers ago will not be criminally charged. More on the breaking news in just a moment.
Now, here's Ari Melber. He's going to give pretty much the same information that the CNN panelists gave.
All right, Melbourne, when you hear about this and knowing that there had been some independent reviews called in this case, also the Tamir Rice family petitioning the Department of Justice to look into it as well, talk about the ramifications and saying these officers are not being charged simply because they fear for their life and they had to fire Tamir Rice.
Yeah, look, this is a decision that has been long awaited. A lot of skepticism about whether this was an investigation that was seeking charges or something else. I think Tim McGinty there, the prosecutor, just answered that because he said the grand jury not returning charges here against these officers for the deadly shooting of Tamir Rice, that 12-year-old boy, and we're seeing that now infamous footage there again on video, something everyone agrees is a tragedy. The question was, is it a crime? You look at our headline here, Francis, at the bottom of the screen, grand jury decides no charges in Tamir Rice case. That's breaking news, that's true. But we also just learned another headline, which is the prosecutor didn't think charges were warranted. Indeed, I was struck by him saying at one point it might have violated his ethical obligations to pursue charges here that were not warranted.
Translation: the DA was looking for any way out for these two officers, and he basically used the Supreme Court and every means that he could, including outside investigations, to back his decision not to charge these two officers. And then he led the grand jury in the direction that he wanted them to go in.
This goes to something that has been pointed out repeatedly in the area of officer-involved shootings, which are so controversial. Is it the normal process or a different process? Well, the breaking news here from Tim McGinty, it is a different process. Typically, a prosecutor would present to a grand jury with a recommendation of charges. That's the whole purpose. He or she would say, this is what we have. Do you support it to charge it? Here, what he said is the opposite, that he has just announced to the world that what he did was present his recommendation of no charges, that he thought this was justified force, and then asked the grand jury, what do you think? And he's telling us here in his announcement that they agreed with him, they supported that. But obviously, what a prosecutor presents has an incredible impact. Those reports you mentioned as well were seen by many as supporting the police. There's nothing wrong with that if that turns out to be accurate. Indeed, I thought the most stunning visual evidence in the presentation was showing the toy gun next to a real gun and making the argument that in real time the police wouldn't be able to tell the difference there.
Yeah, and you have the prosecutor calling and saying, you know what, we don't need these kinds of pellet guns, these air guns made even more, showing again how similar they actually looked. Ari Melber, thank you.
Well, I gotta add one more thing there. I mean,
sure.
Just looking at this news, it's still striking though if you take a step back, even knowing all that this was a 12-year-old boy, and when the car pulls up, the officers don't do much of any analysis, fact-finding, or anything else. They pull up and within seconds shoot this boy. Now, they say they had apprehension and fear of their lives. Of course, they just showed up. That's the big question here that I think is not answered by this prosecutor's presentation was, did they really have the legally required fear of imminent, grievous bodily harm or death to themselves or others? And could they really knowledgeably make that determination within a couple of seconds before this boy was shot dead? The grand jury here telling us they thought that was justified today.
Yeah, interesting, especially when you put in perspective that the person who called the dispatcher at 911 was saying, you know, there's a guy with a pistol, probably fake, and the guy's probably a juvenile as well.
And the prosecutor saying that the officers didn't have that accurate information, but a big part of the puzzle here.
All right, thank you so much. I want to bring in...
Now, hopefully, the Justice Department will take a look at this case and feel the same way or decide the same way that Ari Melber just indicated, that these guys pulled up. Obviously, they weren't in fear for their lives, because if they were, they wouldn't have gotten as close to Tamir Rice as they did. Yet instead, they pull up, jump out of their car. Within a second and a half, this boy is shot and killed.